would it be reasonable then to perhaps make the prediction that this Antichrist will pose as a Christian, perhaps, standing in the temple of God? Is it possible that that could be a possibility that the Antichrist will in fact pose himself as a Christian?
Well, Mike, that's a speculation on your part and my part, but it is a plausible biblical speculation based upon this word study that we're doing. And I haven't even finished this word study. I'm going to go to a few more uses in the New Testament. Then I'm going to get into the book of Daniel and look at the Hebrew words, and we find the very same pattern between metaphorical and literal. So it's astounding what I'm getting ready to tell you.
Yeah.
But based upon what I've already shared with you, yes, I mean, that's a good biblical speculation. That's one possibility, that somehow this metaphorical temple that's spoken of is connected to the last days New Testament church. We already know from the New Testament that the last days there's going to be a great apostasy sweeping through the New Testament church.
Right.
Why couldn't that apostasy result in some kind of an Antichrist figure? Maybe connected with the church in Rome, maybe connected with the Vatican, maybe connected with the apostate New Testament church in general. Maybe, and there are all kind of possibilities when we understand the original words used in the original text.
Maybe a world leader who claims every once in a while to be a Christian but acts like anything but, perhaps. We're not naming names, but...
Yeah, that's another possibility.
Yeah.
So anyway...
Yeah.
This is amazing. Now, all that I've said so far is really important, especially in light of the fact that there are some 450 verses in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation that mention the word temple. And out of those 450 verses mentioning temple, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to prove it. There's not a single verse that clearly and specifically prophesies a third temple being rebuilt. I mean, you have to infer it. But there's not a single verse that speaks literally of a third temple and calls it that, or of a rebuilt temple in the last days. 450 times the Bible speaks of the temple of God in Jerusalem, and never does it speak of a rebuilt temple or a third temple.
Right.
Now, that passage in 2 Thessalonians that I've already talked to, that's the only one where you could maybe infer that might be the case. But again, when you consider that the specific Greek word used in that one verse alone can be used metaphorically. Let's think of a couple of other things. I want to refer to something that Jesus said in Matthew 24, and then let's talk about this 2 Thessalonians and connect it to how Paul uses the word temple, hieron and naos, okay? This is important.
Yes.
Let's look at Matthew 24:15, where Jesus said, "So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." Right. Well, people point to that, and they say, well, see there, Jesus is talking about the holy place in the temple. Well, but that is the only place in the entire Scripture where Jesus says anything about the Antichrist in a holy place. And then he says, but you get your understanding of it from the book of Daniel.
Right.
Now we're going to talk about that in a moment. But first, I want the listeners to understand where Jesus uses the word holy place, the word temple is not connected to that at all.
Right.
And I know people say, well, the holy place is in the temple. Well, maybe, but it doesn't have to be. The words used there in the Greek are simply a place that is holy.
Right.
All right? That's what the Greek literally says.
Right.
But there's no reference. Not only is there no reference to the temple, but Jesus says, if you want to understand what I'm talking about, go look at the book of Daniel. Now, we're going to do that in a moment.
Yes.
So all of this is important. But before we get to Daniel, there's one other thing that I think is another huge clue. Let's look at how Paul uses hieron and naos for the temple in the book of Corinthians, for example, and throughout every single letter he wrote in the New Testament. All right? 1 Corinthians 6:19. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You're bought with a price.
Right.
Well, that's obviously metaphorical, right?
That's right. Yes.
The word he uses for temple is naos.
Naos, okay.
Just like John. Whenever John spoke metaphorically of a temple, he used that. Now, we go to 1 Corinthians 9:13. Paul is speaking again. He says, don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? That's the same book, 1 Corinthians.
Right.
And in the same book, he now uses a different Greek word. He uses hieron.
Hieron, okay.
Because why? Because now he's speaking of the literal temple in Jerusalem. So do you see this pattern?
Yes,
Mike?
yes.
That John and Paul, every time they speak of the literal temple in Jerusalem, in all of their writings, they use the word hieron. But every time John and Paul use the word temple in the symbolic sense or the metaphorical sense, they use the word naos.
So they are establishing, Carl, they have established the pattern for us as to how we should read and study the Scriptures. This is how they have given us the template. This is how you study this. Right.
Well, now you can see why I'm so passionate about
Yes.
this. Again, I'm not dogmatic, but I'm passionate because I'm reading from the original languages. I see the pattern here. They've given us the template, and this was no secret. See, it's a secret to us. We have to unlock this because we don't speak Greek and Hebrew.
Right.
But John and Paul did. They understood, and their readers spoke Greek. They understood the difference. It's only a mystery to us because we speak English 2,000 years later. But when we go back and look at the words, you can see the pattern. It's clearly there. And so don't forget now. So Paul, who in 1 Corinthians, the same book, in chapter 6 and chapter 9, he uses the word symbolically, so he uses naos.
Mm-hmm.
Then he uses the word literally, and he uses the word hieron.
Right.
Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, the only verse in the New Testament that connects the Antichrist with the temple, and he used the word naos, not hieron.
Okay. Okay.
And, I mean, this is just huge.
Amazing.
I don't see how we can come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, and pull that verse out and say, oh, well, this is a literal rebuilt temple. But wait, that's not the word Paul used.
Right.
And if you say he used it to mean a literal rebuilt temple, that would be the only time in the entire New Testament he did that.
Right.
So why would we think he would do that? That would be the only time in the entire New Testament that John or Paul did that. So why would we think that Paul would do that? Well, of course he wouldn't do that. He almost has to be speaking of a metaphorical temple in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. I mean, to be true to the Greek and true to his use of that word. Now, let's go to the Hebrew words for temple in the book of Daniel. All right, now let's look at the Hebrew words that are used for the word temple in the book of Daniel, because Daniel is the only Old Testament book that seemingly associates the Antichrist with the temple. So this is important. I mean, we've already done this massive study of the New Testament words,
yes,
which clearly shows us that the word naos is always used when speaking of a metaphorical temple. And when we get to the only verse in the New Testament that directly connects the Antichrist with a temple, the word naos is used.
Right.
So, I mean, that's pretty clear. So now let's look at the Hebrew words for temple in the book of Daniel, the only book in the Old Testament that seems to connect the Antichrist with the temple.
Uh-huh.
All right? The word is Strong's number 1965. It's like 1965. Mm-hmm. It's a Hebrew word pronounced, it's an Aramaic word, and it's pronounced Haykal. Haykal. Mm-hmm. And Heykal. Haykal.
Mm-hmm.
All right? Now, this word means a palace or a temple or a building.
Right.
Now, it's used several different ways, For example, in Daniel chapter 5, verse 2, we're going to stay right inside the book of Daniel.
Yeah.
He uses the word Haikal to talk about the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, he literally says, quote, the temple in Jerusalem. And
Right.
he uses the word Haikal there.
Yeah.
All right? Now, from the Hebrew lexicon, Haikal can be used as a palace or as a temple. It can be used to speak of the temple in Jerusalem, and it can also be used to speak of a pagan temple.
Uh-huh.
For example, in the book of Ezra, chapter 5, the word is used for the Babylonian temple. Haikal is used there.
Right.
So that's what the word Haikal uses. Now, the book of Daniel uses the word Haikal every single time to speak of the temple in Jerusalem,
Right.
except
Uh-huh.
for when the word temple is associated with the Antichrist.
Wow.
And then another word is used. And I'm
Oh.
going to get to that in just a moment.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is another huge revelation.
No,
I
indeed,
mean,
yeah.
every time Daniel uses the word Haikal, it's used to speak of a literal temple.
Wow.
But when he gets to the temple about the Antichrist, he uses a completely different word. All right, now, there are only two places that our modern translations use the word temple in conjunction with the Antichrist in the Old Testament. Both of them are found in the book of Daniel. There are only 4 verses in Daniel that might imply that the Antichrist is in some sort of a temple. So let's look at these 4 verses.
All right.
All right? We're going to look at them in order. Daniel chapter 8, verse 11. It sets itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away, and it's talking about the Antichrist,
Right.
It took away the daily sacrifice from him,
Mm-hmm.
and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Okay?
Right.
Now, you look at that and say, okay, talking about sacrifices and sanctuary.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. The word sacrifice is not in the original text. It's
Okay.
not there.
Okay.
And the word for sanctuary in our English translations is not Haikal.
Uh-huh.
It's Mikdash,
Mikdash.
which doesn't necessarily speak of a literal temple building. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But you see now he talks about the place of his sanctuary
Mm-hmm.
was brought low. And Daniel uses a completely different word, Mikdash.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Strong's number 4720. We'll talk about that in a moment, but let me keep moving forward.
Yeah.
So you can't say Daniel 8:11 is a literal rebuilt temple in Jerusalem yet. You can't say that.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, the word sacrifice is not in the original text,
Right.
and the word for sanctuary is not the word for temple. It's a completely different word.
Right.
Now we come to Daniel 9:27. Speaking of the Antichrist, it says he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7.
Right.
In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering.
Right.
And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, that's important because that's the verse that Jesus was referring to when he said, if you want to know, what I'm talking about, this holy place, he says, go look at what Daniel says. That's the verse he's talking about.
That's right.
He will put an end to the sacrifice. And on a wing of the temple, he'll set up an abomination that causes desolation. All right, here's the problem. The words of the temple, it's not in the original text.
Wow.
It's not in the Hebrew.
Right.
It's in the English, but that was added by the translators.
Wow.
See?
Yes.
That's why in most English translations you'll find those words of the temple in a bracket, because the Hebrew doesn't have that. The Hebrew simply says, and on a wing he will set up the abomination that
On a
causes
wing.
desolation. You see, the translators, Mike, assumed that
Right.
it meant a wing of the temple.
Ah.
The problem is, there's no reference to a temple anywhere
Wow.
in this passage of Scripture. These are only assumptions by the translators.
You're blowing some minds here, Carl. You're blowing some minds here, brother.
All right, well, let me keep going. So the next passage in Daniel 11:31, it says of the Antichrist, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up an abomination that causes desolation. All right, there's the other passage Jesus had to be referring to. But this translation for temple is not Haikal. Again, it's mikdash, Strong's 4720.
Right.
The word for mikdash is not a literal temple, as in the one in Jerusalem.
Right.
It can be it's translated into English sometimes as temple, but it does not mean the literal temple in Jerusalem. Its true Hebrew meaning simply means a generic sanctuary or a generic holy place of any kind or any type.
Right.
So, of course, it could be used to speak of the sanctuary in the temple in Jerusalem, but here's what's important. It does not have to be used that way, and is used throughout the Old Testament for other sanctuaries or holy places other than the one in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this is huge.
Huge.
This is huge, because Daniel could have easily used the word Hakal, but he didn't.
Right.
He used a completely different word. See, following the same pattern of John and Paul in the New Testament.
Right.
All right? Now, here's the fourth verse, the fourth and last verse. There are only 4 verses in the entire Old Testament that seem to connect the Antichrist with a temple. And here's the fourth one.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel 12:11. Quote, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished, and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days.
Right.
Now, in this text, the word sacrifice has been added by the translators. It's not in the original text.
Oh, man.
And no literal temple building is mentioned in that verse at all. There's nothing about a temple there. So the uses of the word mikdash, as in Daniel 8 and 11 in the Old Testament, that word mikdash is used in the Old Testament as translated as holy one time, holy place 2 times, holy places 1 time. Simply the word place, it's used 1 time. A sacred part of something, it's used 1 time. Sanctuary, it's used 5 times. Or sanctuaries, it's used 5 times. And the singular sanctuary is used 65 times. But never in the Old Testament is the word mikdash used to refer to the temple itself, and especially the temple in Jerusalem. Now, that is huge.
Huge.
Because every time the word temple, translated in English, is used in Daniel in relation to the Antichrist, Daniel chooses the word mikdash, which is never used anywhere in the Old Testament to refer to the temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
So this is a striking revelation. I mean, because if Daniel meant to speak of the Antichrist in a literal rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, he'd use the word Hakal.
Right.
So, anyway, here's the bottom line to all of this.
Yes.
Here's the bottom line. Number one, there's not a single verse of Scripture anywhere that insists upon, nor directly prophesies, a rebuilt third temple in any direct fashion at all. I mean, Mike, as I've demonstrated, there are only a couple of verses out of hundreds of verses about the temple where one might infer that there's a rebuilt literal temple. But from the study we've just done, there are 0 verses where a strong, rock-solid, direct, literal argument is made for a rebuilt temple. It's just not there. Not in the original languages. It is not there. The second bottom line truth, there's not a single Old Testament verse that directly ties the Antichrist to a rebuilt literal temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
In its most literal statement form, it just is not there. And I just finished demonstrating that. Then the third bottom line is this: there's only 1 verse in the entire New Testament that seems to tie the Antichrist directly to some sort of a temple, and that's 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And as I said, in that verse, the Greek word naos is used, and every other time that Greek word is used in the New Testament, it's used to speak metaphorically. So why would we take that 1 verse and say, oh, well, he didn't mean metaphorically here? Why would we do that? I mean, that's a complete violation of biblical interpretation.
Right.
So, and then you add to that there's not a single verse in the entirety of the Bible that predicts a red heifer sacrifice for some kind of a third rebuilt temple. There's not a single verse. So, but on the other hand, think of this, listeners. There are a myriad of New Testament verses that speak of the new temple, quote, being the born-again believer and being the redeemed church,
right,
and being the church in the last days. I mean, this fact is indisputable.
Mm-hmm.
These verses that speak of this metaphorical temple, they are dogmatic. They are direct. I mean, they are to-the-point statements of theological fact found in the New Testament, with entire treatises built around those facts.
Right.
But again, there's not a single verse in the entire Bible, much less the New Testament, that speaks of a third, rebuilt, literal temple in Jerusalem in any dogmatic, direct, or to-the-point fashion. None. There are none. And so I want to conclude this study by saying, look, it very well may be that the Jews will rebuild a third temple in hopes of encouraging the return of their Messiah, which, by the way, is not Jesus, because they utterly reject him.
Right.
They might even sacrifice a red heifer of purification.
Right.
So if you see these things happen, I mean, I wouldn't doubt it if the Jews aren't trying to make that happen.
Right.
However, if we're going to speak purely biblically, those concepts are not in the Bible.
Wow.
And that's the point of my study. And so I just want people to be aware that, listen, we're living in prophetic times.
Yes.
And so if you read these fanciful writings of people who speak of red heifer sacrifices and third temples, and there has to be a rebuilt temple for the Antichrist to be seated upon, and when, I mean, that's not biblical. I mean, it's fanciful.
Right.
It's in some of the fictional literature, and it's in some of the writings of some of the modern day eschatology people. But when you do the study, as we've just done, of the Greek words, the two Greek words in the New Testament and the two Hebrew words in the Old Testament used to denote the temple or something like it, you discover quickly that there's a word for the literal temple in Jerusalem, and there's a word that's used metaphorically. And in both the Old and New Testament, the distinctions are clear.
Carl, I'm so grateful that PNN has a man of your research ability and knowledge of the original languages, and just a passion to dig deeper, to get underneath the superficial and sometimes false writings that we find in the English translations, and to get down to the deeper meanings of these things and bring those to us, Carl Gallups. Once again, shocking the audience. You've just obliterated the beliefs of millions of people, by the way, who are going to be disappointed, but I hope they're going to be thankful that they can feel a little more enlightened to the truth here, Carl.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Mike. And I want to say one more time to the listeners, listen, when it comes to these kinds of things, I am never dogmatic about it, and I don't break fellowship with people who believe differently.
Yeah.
Now, as you can tell, I'm passionate about it because I know how to study these words, and we've done a clearly didactic study of these words.
Right.
Without trying to read anything into anything. We're following the pattern of Paul and John and Daniel, and there's a clear pattern. And so I'm passionate that we need to be very careful about insisting that a literal rebuilt third temple with a red heifer sacrifice is required for the Antichrist, because according to this word study we just did, the Bible does not clearly say that. It just does not. So, I don't want to break fellowship with anybody over this, and I'm not going to stomp my foot and say, by gosh, I'm 1,000% correct and everybody else is wrong. But I will say, go do the study for yourself. Check all the words out for yourself. Get a concordance. Get a lexicon. You'll come to the very same conclusions I've just come to.
Well, and I wouldn't dare assume the power over people's money, but if you're giving money to groups as a Christian, groups which are dogmatic about this rebuilt temple, you may want to rethink where you're putting your money. I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone what to do with their money, but you may want to rethink that. That is not a scriptural basis for that. And by the way, the groups that are promoting this third temple, they don't care what you as a Christian has to say about anything anyway, really. Honestly, do they, Carl?
Right. Well, but usually not, no.
No.
And I'm just going to say, look, I do a lot of television and radio interviews, and a lot of the hosts, I have to be very gracious. I can't go on someone's show and dress them down and correct them in front of their entire audience. But, unless they're preaching heresy, I would. But when it comes to the matter of the temple and people get involved in that discussion, if they ask for my opinion, I'm going to give it to them clearly based upon what I've taught here. But, I'm also going to be gracious and, because there is a possibility. Like I said, I wouldn't doubt if the Jews, they've wanted to rebuild temple ever since the second one was destroyed.
Sure.
So, I know they're planning. There's a lot of Jews in Israel that desperately want a new temple, and they very, very well may go up to the Temple Mount and build an altar even without a temple. But some people are talking about that.
Right.
And they may sacrifice a red heifer, and they may, none of that would surprise me.
Right.
And it wouldn't surprise me if they literally start building a temple or build one. None of that would surprise me. The point that I'm making is, the Scriptures do not directly require this as a last days prophetic fulfillment, especially for the Antichrist to be seated in it.
Jesus himself said, if you tear down this temple, I will raise it up again in 3 days. That prophecy is fulfilled. There is no need for a third temple. And clearly from Carl Gallup's own study, an in-depth study of what the Scriptures really say, and we're talking about the original Scriptures. You've got the templates, you've got the pattern for Bible study with regard to these things. Carl Gallups, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure, Mike. And I also want to say to the listeners, look, this study that I just did with you is completely original to me. Now, what I mean by that is I am sure that other Bible scholars have done the very same thing and have written to this. You may find websites on this, and it would have to be almost word for word what I said, because I just took it straight from the Scriptures and straight from the lexicons.
Right.
But what I just shared with you didn't come from some other man's work. It didn't come from another website. I literally took my Greek lexicon, my Hebrew lexicon, my concordance, and went through every word, as I just did with you, in the New Testament and Old Testament that comes anywhere near connecting the Antichrist with a temple. And I did a complete study on my own and came to the conclusions that I just showed you. So I just want the audience to know this. I didn't just go snatch this off of another website and regurgitate it.
Right. This
was the result of my lengthy, in-depth, word-by-word study. And I just shared it with the audience, and they can go check behind me now and do the same thing, but they will see that what I have said is absolutely accurate.
Well, the only other place I've seen it, Carl, is on the PNN blog, which is ppsimmons.blogspot.com, and you wrote that article. So, this is all new to me.
Well, I haven't even tried to go around and see if other scholars have seen this, but I'm sure they have. There are people who've made their entire life to study the Greek and the Hebrew. But I know what the Greek lexicon says. I know what the Hebrew lexicon says, and I just shared it with the audience, and there it is. So,
yeah.
But even more important than that, Mike, is the study we did of the patterns.
Right.
The patterns that Paul uses, and John uses, and Daniel uses. It's just striking that every time they speak of the literal temple, they use one word, but every time they speak of the Antichrist, maybe being connected to some kind of a temple, they use a completely different word that's always used metaphorically.
Right. Well, you've summed it up quite nicely here. I'm going to let you go because you're a busy guy. I know you've got 300 more interviews to do today, probably. You got another book coming out, right?
Yes, I do. My next book coming out is already huge, and it's not even off the press yet.
Wow.
There are ministries that have bought up many, many, many thousands of them already before they've even come off the presses. It's called Be Thou Prepared, Equipping the Church for Times of Persecution and Trouble. And it's published by WND Books, as all my books have been thus far, and it will be released September 15th of 2015.
Well, as a highly influential member of the alternative media, I already have a pre-release copy, and I highly recommend it, folks. Be thou prepared. Another bestseller by Carl Gallups. That's my prediction. Carl Gallups, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. God bless you.
All right, bye-bye.